encapsulated a very close version of what we would end up with. But still, we always need to understand what transfers over. At any stage of the process, we need to consider what actually does move forward. What are the things that I actually need to take from my thumbnail? And I think because often we do, as I said, look at these really nice loose lines that often come from images, from thumbnails, from drawing small. Often artists also like to just find their shapes small, because you can often find really magical shapes drawing small that you cannot find drawing big. Or at least it's often quite challenging to find them drawing big. So we often get really drawn to this sketchiness and this looseness. And when we translate that into finished lines, into finished illustration, we often lose that in the beginning. You lose that energy, and it feels as if the sketch was better. And I think that's what I want to talk about today, is specifically how this process functions and how one of the major traps you can fall into is thinking that you need to trace your sketches, you need to trace your thumbnails, that there's some magic there, that if we kind of lose that, the illustration is just never going to be quite as good as the sketch. I guess the first point that's worth making here is that thumbnails don't necessarily capture a lot of drawing. By definition, everything that you're going to see in your thumbnail, every single little thing, will never be seen by the person who sees your finished art. They're going to get lost. They're going to disappear into the ether. Essentially, it is irrelevant how nice the thumbnails are, how nice the sketches look. The only thing that matters is, what does the finished image look like? And I think often because we often have that energy to our sketches, and it's so much harder to have energy in a finished painting, or a finished illustration, a finished line and color illustration, a finished comic page, finished concept art, whatever it is, often there is just a natural energy and emotion you get when you're not being quite so tight in detail. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're losing something by letting the sketch go, by letting the thumbnail go, and just understanding where it fits within our process. So the key thing to understand here is that thumbnails kind of capture our plan. They capture the decisions we're making about the drawing, and that often part of like a creative process, if we think about the idea of doing sketches and making things loose, it's that is part of the process where we find the gesture of the drawing. We may draw really loose, we may draw really sketchy, I may draw really simple and have a nice thumbnail that has great shapes, and when I refine that, it kind of loses that energy to it. It loses the simplicity. And often I find that I've known a lot of artists who use this as a major aspect of their entire process, where they will really try and hold on to a lot of the shapes they create small. Now, there is a strategy to that where I will just say, if you really are having an entire style that is based around capturing large shapes that you can't really be defined with those kind of small drawings, then there is some logic to that, to like drawing small, to make sure you focus on big shapes. But what I find is that more often than not, that's not quite what's happening. What's happening is that we are just holding on to the energy and the shapes and whatever is kind of created in the thumbnail and the sketch, and we're just not practicing really translating that to a finished image. And I think what this means is that we don't often practice putting a lot of that gesture and motion into our finished drawings. But at its core, you need to understand that what's happening when we do our thumbnails is we're planning, we're making decisions, we're saying this goes here, I have a tone of layout, I'm trying to think about and giving myself an opportunity to be rough so I can think about where things line up, what is the big shape here, and also you're working in a medium that is disposable. You can throw away that thumbnail, I'm going to do another one. This gets you into the right creative mindset of thinking about the big picture, not getting attached into it. And this is the power and value of the thumbnail. It's not that we need to capture that thumbnail forward, it's that this allows us to come up with a good set of decisions, a good plan for an image. Likewise, if you think about a similar adjacent problem of us often falling in love with our sketches, just understand that probably no one's going to see the sketches if our goal is to create finished illustrations. These are going to, as I said, disappear. But you're giving yourself an opportunity at the sketching phase to flow, to to not necessarily worry about every line being perfect, but to create that gesture, create that motion, go into a space creatively where you can feel the emotion and the gesture and the line of the drawing, and it'll get messy. And subsequently, we will be able to bring out more emotion because we're putting ourselves in a drawing frame where we can make mistakes, where we can feel, we can make things nice and sketchy. But also realize that often what makes sketchy drawings look so good is that they're sketchy. The real question is that which one of those lines are we going to import? How do we refine that drawing? Now that we've had that creative process of figuring out the gesture, of feeling the figure, or whatever it is, that's sort of being loose and being sketchy, now that you've gone through that process of finding some good lines in there, it's a matter of picking which one is the best. It's a matter of thinking maybe next a little bit more about structure, about details, about secondary form and tertiary form. The things that will often make your drawing and illustration look really polished. And just understand that the thing that makes a really great artist's finished work feel as if it is loose and spontaneous is not necessarily that they slavishly hung on to the energy of the thumbnail, but that they figured out how to create finished work that also feels spontaneous. And often what happens when you get really good at drawing and creating very polished finished drawings and focusing on that is you get good at giving those with energy as well. And that allows you to be more spontaneous with the paint strokes, with the finished line, with the colors you use. The more that you have a solid drawing, the easier it is then at the finished line to add a little bit more flourish and sketchiness and emotion to it as well. So I think the key idea here is just to understand what we're doing at those different stages. We're often not creating finished work that anyone's going to see, but we're putting ourselves in a creative mindset. In the case of thumbnails, thinking about the plan of the image, or if you're doing sketchier roughs, of being able to draw and have fun and make a million mistakes and erase and experiment. And this supports what comes next, but it's not something that we need to feel as if we need to drag kicking and screaming into that next phase. Each phase is a matter of redrawing and reimagining the previous stage in a way that supports what you want to do with the finish. The second thing that I think is worth pointing out is why specifically tracing or thinking about where we have been causes so many problems, and why this is a real trap. Now, this is something that I fell into frequently early on. What I would do is be having these nice little loose thumbnails that I have created. Here's some from my Pinocchio cover that I think I sort of showed before. This is from a previous video, this on sort of thumbnail, this set of images, and I just thought I'd use it again because it perfectly illustrates what I'm talking about. But here we have some cool little thumbnails with some cool sketches, some cool lines, some cool bits and pieces. And I guess one of the dangers is that if we pay too much attention to the looseness, or I really get attached to some of the interesting shapes that I've made, is that I'm still looking backwards. I'm not really thinking about creativity going forward and like, how could I change that? How could I make that better? And it often tighten up. And that's often the opposite of what you actually need to be doing, which is thinking about, for instance, here I've got a Pinocchio cover that never got made, and thus proves the point that no one cares about Knuckles, no one will ever know about Knuckles. They only care about the finished cover that got made. We as artists sometimes appreciate the behind the scenes, but most people just want to see the finish. That's what matters. That's what made it up to the book stands. That's what actually made a difference to the book. But here, I think this is a great example where, like, you could be doing little thumbnails, and I've created so many little funny shapes with these chickens and things. And the real trick is that when I draw that chicken, and I'll show you some examples of how I draw chickens on the cover in the finish, I really needed to reconstruct the chicken because I need to add where the wings are. I need to really think about, like, where do those feathers go? I need to think about what the structure of that animal is, or where its feet are going to be. And then to do that, I actually need to redraw it. I need to go beyond that kind of very simple sketch that I had. And I think this is the key for most artists, where you're sort of bringing the art forward, is we are adding more detail or refinement in some way, shape, or form. And The danger is that I get attracted too much and stuck too much to these nice little funny shapes that I create. The same with Pinocchio. What I would probably find is many of the proportions of this sketch are actually going to be wrong. They're a little bit off, and because things are so small, when it's a little bit off, it's actually a lot off. Because a little bit off when the lines are really big is not quite as important, because I'm sort of zoomed out and I'm like, oh, that's kind of good. But if I actually traced all those elements, I think what I find is some of them are wrong, some of them are right, and at some point you kind of have to make the decision to redraw it and look at what you do have and how you can make that interesting. So I guess theoretically we could look at the job here of translating a thumbnail to a more refined construction drawing. It is a matter of redrawing the chicken, reimagining the chicken as something that is more detailed. But I still want to see if I can get what I can from the gesture of the thumbnail. So we don't fully let it go, but we need to understand what actually transitions over. So there are some really nice lines here that I can use to simplify these chickens. There is often a gesture or a feeling to something like the way Pinocchio is walking, the way I just may have haphazardly posed and created a nice gesture for the characters that is good to translate over. But the trick is I can't do it by tracing it. I can't just do it by copying the thumbnail. I need to create it again. I need to completely start from scratch and try and, as much as possible, get into the habit of using the thumbnail as inspiration, as part of that process where I move it forward. So here we got some other little chickens, and what I had to do when I constructed them was think, as we can see here, a little bit more about some of the secondary forms. They're still simple, they're still basic, but I needed to construct the neck, to think about where the neck really intersects with the body. I needed to think about where the legs were and how that might function. Now again, these are not realistic chickens by any means, but it's a good example of how frequently what happens is you need to move the limbs around, you need to think and reconstruct the figure and think about how are they holding themselves, how exactly big are they in relation to all the other characters, where are they sitting on the ground. And when I actually draw something like the cat here, when I actually draw this where it's actually holding its walking stick and it's actually sitting on the ground, and the walking stick is like touching the ground in the same place that the feet are on the ground plane, things will change. And all of a sudden, a lot of that gesture that I may have thought I dialed in doesn't work. And I need to think about how I can reposition that character so they're drawn with fidelity. And I'm going to try and maybe look at the thumbnail as a good indication of where they should be and how they should feel. But yeah, it's so important to get away from the idea that we need to trace the thumbnail or all we're doing is slavishly repeating it. And it's often these little things that will allow you in the finished image to actually add a lot of that detail and think about the character, who they are, and what they're actually doing. So you can see with finished drawing, it's only through being able to redraw and readjust all those little elements, make sure that I've got all good tangents are happening, that I'm actually able to create a polished and finished illustration. So I think that's just a really important thing to understand, is that often when we're too concerned with the thumbnail and tracing it, it's kind of like we're not looking forward, right? We're always looking back and we're trying to preserve something that didn't really exist, and we're not in that creative mindset where I'm thinking about, hey, I'm drawing this cool thing, let's go with what's happening here. If you have a happy accident, if suddenly I start drawing one of these chickens and it starts to work, I need to be able to flow with that. I need to be able to move with that. And I think this is just a really important thing to understand about the process of translating it from to finish. So a good way to think about this is less about tracing and more a matter of translation. And I'm trying to build that muscle of translating thumbnails into sketches and sketches into finished images. There is always a gap that you need to bridge, and I think the more that you can get used to trying to match the feeling or the decisions that you've made within the thumbnail, and if something really works, try and sort of bring it forward, but always have the ability in your mind that the thumbnail is not important. It's not what people are going to see. They're going to see the drawing you're doing right now, and that is the thing that you need to view character and interest, using the level of fidelity that you have. think about the level of detail you need to add to your finished image. How can you take the gesture or the feeling or the emotion that you have in your thumbnail, but instead of copying or tracing it or trying to hold on to it, think about translating it. Now, this is a big challenge. I'm not saying like that's just easy, but I guess this is a muscle that we build through stepping through our creative process of going from the thumbnail to the rough construction drawing to maybe multiple rough construction drawings to finished lines to the colors or whatever your process is. Again, a lot of people who are using the painting process who start with a very broad, vague mood and then go specific and start adding details as they progress, but they still need to be following the thumbnail. This idea of stepping through your process, but always being present with where you are and focusing on how to improve the drawing you have right now, I think is one of the primary muscles we need to build as illustrators. Anyway, that's all we got time for on this particular video. Just a quick one. This is one of these questions that often comes up and I often see people tripping up over it. So I just wanted to go a little bit deeper. Let me know if this helps to conceptualize your creative process and whether you've sort of run into these problems before. I certainly fell foul of this early on where I developed a lot of this around light bulbs, tracing one thing into another thing, and I did feel like often got to the stage where like I didn't feel like I could draw anything unless I had a thumbnail and traced, and I would kind of always be hanging on to this thing, and I felt a lot of liberation, and my work really was able to get to that next level when I just developed the ability to draw in a more sort of polished, finished way based on that thumbnail. But again, just kind of almost as an exercise, what I do is just throw it away. I just get that thumbnail and often just actually from eyeing it, do a very rough version of what the thumbnail was, and then just kind of throw away the thumbnail. So this is what I've got. I need to create this. And I really built that muscle for trying to create that energy, trying to create that feeling and emotion, but with a more finished illustration, with a more finished construction drawing. So I found this one really, really useful. Now, I haven't given you any demonstration of how this actually works, but if you want to see a real-time, fully narrated version of me stepping through an illustration from start to finish, check out this video. That is frequently the cause of our art not working, especially when it comes to creating more finished images, finished illustrations, larger works, especially when we have a lot of detail, is our ability to plan. How much we spend time creating thumbnails or figuring out just what we need to do with this image. But it's no easy task to figure out how much you should plan and how you should plan. What I want to do in this video is talk about how I like to build some 5% rules. And this is really simple. What it sounds like. You should probably spend at least 5% of your overall time creating art planning what that's going to be. Personally, this took me a long time to really get my head around. When I started out, I thought that thumbnails really equaled professional illustration, and when you're going for some epic level of complexity and finish, but what I found is that this really relates to everything, and I found a lot of success applying it to even my sketchbook and just messing around. So what I want to do in this video is talk about how often the problem is that we're just not planning exactly the right amount for our artistic goals. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Wheel. My name is Dennis Bernie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get the detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something that you're interested in. So the problem is that often when we look at thumbnails and the idea of planning your images, you see a lot of stuff like this. And this is Exactly right. This is Creative Illustration by Andrew Lewis, which I am always talking about on the channel because it's just a great example of how planning your illustrations was a major part of the everyday life of an illustrator, and it still is. This is what you get trained to do. You take pretty much any course on illustration, and the idea of planning and doing thumbnails and ideation is also part of pretty much every style of art. But often we do associate it with finished art, with a brief, with having to ideate, and maybe it doesn't apply quite so much, especially to beginners who aren't often exposed to this, to just the everyday art mode, to your sketching and your much simpler images. You can see here that this concept is repeated again and again, and one of the things that Andrew Lewis talks about in creative illustration is how you often do need to sort of plan things and iterate and mess around. And this is also one of the things that I find we can often get sidetracked with when it comes to illustration, is that thumbnails and planning are there for when you need to deal with clients, you need to do lots of iterations, you need to come up with ideas, but they're often less there for us to explore our own mind, our own ideas. And even if you have a very clear picture of what you want to do, the reality is that a thumbnail can be an excellent way of figuring out and doing those kind of first steps. So I think this is a really important point to understand, and it's one of the things that honestly I find so many students don't get about what it takes to create an illustration, or even what it takes to get an image from your imagination down onto the page. So as I said, one of the things that I found really helped actually was thumbnailing pretty much everything. And I think this can feel a little bit challenging early on if you're sort of thinking, hey, actually matching a thumbnail is an easy task. And this is true. It is a skill we need to build to be able to think in stages. But what I'd like to share with you through some examples as we sort of look at is how this is also something that gives you a lot of flexibility with your process, and you can actually enhance your creativity overall. And I think this is often really the root cause of us being able to unlock those much more complicated, detailed illustrations. We often need to go to this level, and one of the other things that often is part of this kind of puzzle is that frequently we do kind of only practice thumbnails and matching a thumbnail and kind of like process of like, okay, I've got a thumbnail, it's looking good, I like it, maybe the client has picked it, maybe I picked it, maybe it's the only thumbnail I've created, like who knows, but how do I turn a thumbnail into a finished illustration of any kind? Or like, how do I turn a thumbnail into a more finished drawing or a more finished sketch or a speed painting or whatever you're doing? I think that there's a lot of focus these days because it's so fun to watch people kind of draw in this free-form manner without any planning on sort of TikTok or Instagram Reels, etc. It's a really fun idea, but I think the reality is a huge volume of great illustrations are planned, right? And they're often planned to quite a large degree, and there's a process to it. So this is one of the things I often teach. I think it's so important to understand that illustration and drawing in itself are often steps. It's not just one process, it's many little processes, and the more reliable you can make this, the better. So to go back to what I was mentioning, what I kind of actually found is one of the best ways to practice this, if you're sort of saying, like, okay, maybe it's intimidating to do a whole bunch of thumbnails for an illustration, and maybe you don't have and you don't want to spend your whole life doing 40-hour finished illustrations that you have this gigantic planning process to. This is where this concept of 5% really sort of clicks with me, and maybe understand that this is just a matter of, no matter what we're doing, giving ourselves the time and the space and the permission to plan it and to think about it. And the real trick here that is to really help your entire artistic game is that as you practice creating little plans, little sketches, or even your sketches, or sketchbook images, or just kind of something you're going to spend like half an hour on, an hour on, like whatever it is, something that's more in that kind of speed art realm. Practicing spending a little bit of time planning that, and I think 5% is a great little kind of target to aim for, will help you also when it comes to creating larger and complicated illustrations. Because as I said, art is created through a process, and the more you can get used to your process, the more reliable and easy it is for you to understand that. And the more you get used to saying, okay, here's a thumbnail, how do I make that into a finished illustration? How do I make that into a more detailed drawing? To think about the process that you use to do that. The more you can do that, I think the better everything